FMV, or full motion video games, are something of a dying breed, given that they were created during the early 80s and 90s. Games like Night Trap and Harvester come to mind, a time where high-quality visuals were somewhat limited, but developers wanted to impress people with high-quality graphics in the form of video files, so that the people arguing that graphics were the penultimate defining quality of a computer game would be able to point at games utilizing full-motion video and say, "Now this is a game." I'm not too well versed in the genre, but I know that pretty much any game utilizing recordings of live-action characters in an interactive game counts as FMV, although some might be more stringent on the classification than I am. I never personally got too into any until I watched a Let's Play that introduced me to a neat little game called At Dead of Night, a survival horror game with ghost hunting puzzle elements centered around a college girl named Maya, whose car has broken down before she happens upon a hotel owned by an unsettling man named Jimmy, who offers her entertainment in the form of his alter ego comedic persona, Hugo Punch. But upon Maya declining and leaving for her room, Jimmy becomes frustrated with her refusal, before turning to a mirror and seeing his psychopathic alter ego communicating with him, at which point we see Maya finding a spirit box full of dead souls begging her to expose Hugo for what he's done, which is all the context we need to start the game. And this video will contain spoilers in terms of gameplay mechanics and story beats, if you care about that sort of thing, although you won't be missing much as the writing itself isn't anything terribly subversive. There's so much cool stuff about this game, which is exactly why I bought it on a whim and saw it through to the end. The live-action visuals are extremely novel. The acting for every character adds a level of authenticity and texture that really set it apart from any other game in the genre. The audio mixing and atmosphere is literally masterful.
What's your name?
Harvey. I run the place.
The visuals are mind-bogglingly beautiful without ever dipping into the uncanny valley a single time, but I can't in all good conscience recommend it as a game, seeing as the gameplay is less complicated than Five Nights at Freddy's. That's a fucking sentence, but I get ahead of myself. As you walk around the halls, following the compass and scrying mirror clues to lead you towards the spirit you're trying to find in order to learn what happened to them and resolve their story, you'll eventually hear a noticeably audible dense thump, signaling that Jimmy's alter ego, Hugo Punch, has entered from the nearby stairwell, which serves as the primary gameplay you'll be experiencing for your time playing At Dead of Night. At this point, you have to listen intently to the sounds Hugo makes, including loud heckles he'll occasionally shout out. It's really well done, as despite him being a dot on a map that will play an animation of him walking by, it sells the illusion that he's a real person prowling the hallways, looking for a guest to subdue. If you see him in the distance as he ducks around a corner, or if you hear intimately close footsteps nearby, there's a very good chance you'll be forcibly turned around and bludgeoned by his baseball bat, which is quite effective at a jump scare, considering the silence that precedes it, aided by Hugo's abrupt scream as he lunges at you. As a brief aside, in order to understand how I digest horror, you need to know that I'm the kind of person who likes to play with enemy AI, figure out where they can and can't go, understand their limitations, see how smart they are, and so on. So naturally, when I encountered an FMV enemy, I knew his AI was going to be extremely limited. What I mean by that is that all characters being recorded have a very narrow range of motion in terms of how far they can walk, since it's just a transparent MOV green screen video file, which explains why every visual is a character walking across a screen, moving off screen, standing completely still before the camera dips to black, etc. This meant I could rule out the idea of Hugo rushing me from the end of the hall, because no matter how long I stood there and stared, Hugo would bashfully remain in place around the corner and then magically teleport right next to me the moment you turn away for a second. Hugo as a murderous antagonist isn't menacing or complicated enough to be scary for long stretches of time. He says creepy stuff to intimidate you, and you listen to the sounds coming from the hallway to tell how far away he is, and you hide when he breaks into your room. Mechanically, he's more of a nuisance than a threat, especially considering that nothing of value is lost on standard difficulty, and you can't get a game over until the very last mission, which I'll explain later. He isn't very smart and will behave very predictably the vast majority of the time. Compare this to Nemesis from Resident Evil 3 on the PS1, who can strike anytime, anywhere, and his AI, while not incredibly complicated, keeps the player on their toes, since they don't know when or where he'll appear next. Hugo, on the other hand, will always appear by the elevator and start making his way down the halls, occasionally occasionally investigating when he sees you. Listening to Hugo's location would normally be a pretty standard task, but Maya insists on mouth breathing 90% of the time, which covers up important audio cues, as well as a constant banging on the second floor, making it difficult to hear footsteps. And eventually, on the first floor, the sound of a blaring radio that seemingly has no origin point and cannot be turned off under any circumstance, aside from simply ignoring it and progressing through the story. I understand that this is all for the sake of making the task of hearing Jimmy's proximity less effortless, since being able to clearly hear him would make locating him pretty simplistic, but I can't tell you how much of a headache I was getting from all of these concurrent noises, to the point where I was really irritated that there wasn't an audio volume slider for each individual sound, but I suppose that would defeat the purpose. I'd imagine it would be a lot better if there was a way to eliminate the foreign sounds and have them turn back on every now and again, so it felt like you had more control over your audio environment without completely trivializing their obstructive nature, because as it currently stands, it feels like you're trying to listen to a couple arguing through the wall while your roommate stands next to you and breathes heavily in your ear. Hugo has 3 audio volumes: incredibly far away, moderately far away, and very close, which are all determined by how much reverb the sounds have. Like if you listen and you can't hear anything or barely hear any audio, you're safe to come out of the room. But if you hear plush footsteps creaking against the carpet, he's either directly next to you or in front of the door you're hiding behind. You can press the D key to turn down the audio for a few seconds and hear clearly, but this is only marginally useful, especially since this only affects the ambient soundtrack noise and nothing else. Hugo as an antagonist often falls flat in terms of adding tension. The gameplay formula goes as follows. You get the spirit box from the first floor storage room. Use your mirror to get a very obvious clue where to go. Go to the area and use the mirror again to get an even more obvious clue, like the room number, a relevant item, or the specific area you have to go to. And attempt to navigate the hallways while your mouse's arrow icon rotates constantly between left and right, or turn around, making it very likely you'll accidentally go a direction you don't want to, since there's an easing motion on the arrow itself that will make you go in a direction before you're fully aware that you will. You must do all of this before Hugo arrives on the floor, and if you want to continue looking around unobstructed, just make your way to the elevator or stairs, lure Hugo to your current floor by shouting from a nearby room, and come back later so you can abuse the grace period again to search without a murderous clown constantly wasting your time and forcing you to get lost. You can then continue searching around the area until Hugo spots you, at which point you'll run into a nearby room and hope he doesn't see you. If he sees you and starts unlocking your door, you'll have to hide in the wardrobe in the middle of the room or the bathroom adjacent to the door. If you decide to hide in the bathroom for some reason, you'll have to pray that the RNG doesn't kill you, as he'll sometimes open the door and hit you on the head, because the only issue with hiding in the wardrobe is that he'll come in and occasionally hide in the bathroom, only to emerge and clock you when you try to leave. So if you don't want to risk dying, just don't hide in the bathroom. When you get knocked out, and you will, and dragged to another room, you have to find the elevator, return to the first floor, and repeat this formula until you've uncovered the mystery of the hotel and gotten to the end of the game. Although honestly, it's often faster to just let Hugo club you, retrieve your spirit box, and continue unobstructed, since dying clears him from every floor, and the only other thing he'll take from you are your stairwell keys, which is only a small inconvenience as he's quite easy to avoid even with waiting for the elevator having a small risk attached to it. It's also kind of dumb that Hugo never kills you. He just whacks you with a bat, drags you into a random room, steals your spirit box, and puts it in the exact same place every time. I get that this was likely implemented because otherwise the game would need to have a permadeath design mandated, but contextualizing being bludgeoned repeatedly is a confusing idea from a consistency standpoint. If he simply grabbed you and you blacked out and woke up in the same room every time, I feel like that would make more sense than seemingly dying of blunt force trauma before miraculously waking up every time no worse for wear. It really trivializes Hugo's lethality and turns him into Slappy the Clown, who beats you and then plays hide and seek with you without ever growing tired of it. And Maya, for whatever reason, feels so inherently indebted to these spirits that she endures one bludgeoning after another in order to get to the bottom of the story, which by the resolution ends up being little other than Jimmy is a crazy person who was abused as a child and now suffers from violent and sadistic tendencies as a result of his split personality. Pretty much anyone in Maya's shoes would take the first beating and be like, ow, holy shit, fuck this, I'm out. Like honestly, I have no issue suspending disbelief, and I'm hardly the type of dude who gets upset over movie plot holes and the like, because I'm just a good little brainless consumer when it comes to writing, which is definitely my biggest flaw as a critic. But for a horror game to not threaten you with the possibility of death, that sort of trivializes the stakes a bit. It would be like getting killed in Resident Evil 4 by a chainsaw ganado, and you see a cutscene of Leon just screwing his bloody severed head back on and saying, all right, let's try that again. I do have to give truckloads of credit to the actors' performances, which have to be the best selling point, despite the cast being so small at only 6 people, including including Jimmy, Maya, and the 4 ghosts. You have Amy, the daughter of a hotel guest who was bullied by Jimmy, Dr. Bose, a clinical psychiatrist that was, for one reason or another, attempting to help rehabilitate the clearly mentally troubled Jimmy with no success. Harvey, the once hotel proprietor who would aggressively trade acts of violence with Jimmy, and Jimmy's mother Rose, who did the best that she could to run a successful hotel in spite of her son's worsening mental health. The performances are all very good, most notably Amy, who might have the best acting I've ever seen a child display. Every cutscene shows her being sad and upset, so when you finally make contact with her and hear her pathetic responses, it immediately elicits sympathy and a genuine interest in helping to lay her spirit to rest.
Is it Amy?
Dr. Bose, meanwhile, is a fittingly arrogant doctor who sounds like he feels disgust towards anyone who would question his procedures.
I saw you holding up a dead animal on a wire. What had happened?
Jimmy was killing things, small birds, animals. I realized he needed to work on his empathy skills. So I asked him to think of something nice he could do for me.
Harvey is a hot-headed individual who just sounds completely done with Jimmy's bullshit.
Who did the chef's hat belong to?
The chef. Who else wears a chef hat?
And Rose sounds like a caring yet foolish woman who knowingly exacerbated Jimmy's childhood abuse. And it goes without saying, of course, that my having a decent pair of headphones like my Sony WH-1000 XM3 noise-canceling beauties made every auditory moment of this game borderline boner-inducing, with the incredibly dramatic reverb-heavy sound that plays when Hugo exits the room, leaving an extremely memorable impression, like the gravity of you escaping discovery is being fully realized. The voices are so crisp and compressed that it made me question at times whether the scenes were dubbed over. It's worth noting that it sounds like Maya is speaking every interrogative line uniquely, by which I mean it sounds like she recorded every single piece of dialogue in full rather than recording in parts. Like when you hear those navigation voices say something like, in 1 mile, exit right to 494 west. They had a person record each individual component of that, so they could use it as flexibly as they'd want. So when I hear Maya speaking these lines, I can only conclude that they had her record every possible combination of, I saw X, does that have anything to do with Y? It's generally pretty hard to edit around natural breaths, but I think I have a point. Like, listen for yourself, I genuinely think they didn't edit these 2 lines together at any point, and if they did, I'm completely fooled.
What you said about Jimmy stealing your toy, does that have something to do with what you said about the turpentine and lighter? When you said you'd heard the story somewhere before, does that have something to do with what you said about the diazepam? When you said Harvey was worried about Jimmy's mind, does that have something to do with what you said about the scrapbook?
It's also great how the game uses ethereal reverse echo to build suspense. You know that audio trick people use to make ghosts sound ghosty? You just record a line, reverse it, add an echo, and then reverse it again so it plays back normally, and bam, you have a dramatic spirit sound to your voice line. Normally, I'd consider this standard fare for anything dealing with the supernatural, but considering players will likely be apprehensively waiting to hear if they cleverly piece the clues together correctly, it always made me feel victorious to hear that gradually audible voice recording mixed with the inverted reverb and slight sparkling sound effect used to convey that I've made the proper connection and will now move forward with the storyline.
Does that have anything to do with what you said about the washing line and rolling pin?
I experimented with the washing line, but it was too thin. I found some rope instead.
Alright, that was all of my praise, and now it's time to be a critical douche again. The scrying mirror animation has you holding up the mirror once you're in a dark enough place, at which point you'll have to sit through this padded out cutscene with Jimmy flashing toward the camera, peeking around corners, lunging with a bat, and just generally reminding you, hello, yes, I am serial killer, please fear me, before and after you watch some cinematics that clue you in as to where you should go next, which often takes up to a full 50 seconds, like 50, if you're juggling 2 spirits simultaneously, like Dr. Bose and Harvey, and have to wait for both of their faces and clues to play out. Maybe leave it in there as an RNG element, to have one play every 3 or so uses to spice it up and catch players off guard. But what's the point of including a visual that's presumably used to spook people, when it's going to reliably happen every single time, thereby killing the surprise? Also, it's clear that Baggy Cat, the developer, didn't record enough footage to use for these scenes, and he had to use this obscured 3D 3D model of Hugo, which, when you look close enough, it's very distractingly not a real person. Which is one more detail that makes me question what this adds to the experience. It goes to show you that FMV is an extremely cool novelty, but not one without limits, as you have to film everything while everyone's in costume, and flying everyone out to record their performances locally is quite costly and inconvenient, especially in this day and age. Not to mention, if you end up needing 1 or 2 small reshoots, you're somewhat out of luck, considering it's probably more trouble than it's worth, and you'll likely opt to just cut the idea out, or scrap numerous other aspects as well, as opposed to just animating a 3D model at your will at no additional cost, which explains why FMV games are considered something of a relic. I've been fairly active on the Steam discussion forums for this game, and I found that the developer has remained silent on certain gameplay criticisms, such as Hugo's spooky imagery and why he thinks it's necessary to include it in the mirror cutscenes, which is mind-numbing considering it's one of the greatest flaws the game possesses, as you'll regularly resort to it as literally the only resource to figure out how to progress, and it will needlessly extend your playtime, which means people who play this game and only barely scratch the story's surface will be completely unable to refund the game should they find the puzzles too tedious to tolerate. I watched the excellent horror Let's Player John Wolf play through this in full, which prompted me to buy it in the first place, and even he seemed pretty exasperated by the game at numerous points in his playthrough, like he was enjoying the overall package, but hated the moment-to-moment gameplay, and after playing it for myself, I completely understand why. It's just very slow. The tension wears off incredibly quickly, and it ends up feeling like an extremely tepid game of cat and mouse, where you just have to hope you won't get lost and have to hide in rooms repeatedly as Hugo walks away before returning shortly after, and attempt to crack the oftentimes cryptic puzzles. It's a mystery/puzzle game that wants to be a horror game, but it leans too little on the horror element, to the point where Hugo ends up being more of a nuisance than anything, and solving puzzles ends up encouraging the obnoxious strategy of spin in circles and wait for a few moments until you look in the right direction, and stare long enough to activate the ghost animation. The blinking lights are the biggest giveaway in regards to where you should generally go, but it's obnoxious that the game is so particular about it. Sometimes you'll see a ghost in a hallway, but it wants you to communicate inside of a room instead, or it'll make you look through a peephole in order to play the cutscene. Or you'll see a ghost in a hallway, but it wants you to stand directly where it was standing. Why I can't communicate with a spirit from 1 or 2 spaces away is beyond me, which is hilarious once you realize that ghosts in real life, should you choose to even remotely believe in them, have been observed to be willing to communicate with anyone as long as they're inside of the building. As a small nitpick, I know he recorded incredibly high-quality DSLR video of people and put them in the game under the explanation that these are a sort of memory that you're experiencing. But why are these spirits normal-ass looking humans? Why weren't they given some sort of wispy, transparent detail to further sell the idea that they are indeed in the afterlife instead of Maya just tripping balls? It just sort of falls apart the more you think about it. But the obvious immersion-breaking answer is that Baggy Cat just used the footage verbatim and had the video dip to black before the actors would vanish to contextualize that they are in fact simply ghostly visions. I also completely detest the level layout, which feels like a figure 8 in terms of understanding where to go. The exit arrow helps once you notice it at the fork in the hallway, but I'd love having a map in your hotel room or by the stairs just to glance at once and make your way over so your understanding of the map begins to gradually solidify. Most of the time I die, it's because I have no earthly idea where I'm going, even if it could be justified as a fire escape sort of map, like most hotels have in each room. I think that would be a huge leg up without hand-holding players too much. As it stands right now, I still just click aimlessly until I reach either the elevator or a dead end, and I have zero chance of grasping where any of the identical areas will lead me to, since some lamps, props, and otherwise carpet color differences are the only distinguishing characteristics in every otherwise visually indistinct floor. This is further exacerbated by the ghost mechanic being find the ghost and ask some questions, wherein asking too many incorrect questions will make the ghost gradually fade away, forcing you to leave the floor and come back immediately, or restart the game and load the autosave, which is faster. In the final case, for example, Jimmy's mother Rose has one puzzle that's different from the rest. In every single spirit box puzzle prior, you had to go to an area, witness the ghost event, and then ask the spirit if the event you just saw has anything to do with this object you found. And if you answer correctly, you're shown a visual before the ghost leaves and you have to do it all over again for the next part. But Rose's story has a section towards the end where you have to go to multiple different areas hinted by spamming the spirit box before finding multiple events and objects and coming back to the same place in order to progress. It's just weird that every puzzle prior to this followed the same format, but only right at the the end was the conveyance needlessly hampered in order to appear as if this was a really rough puzzle to solve, when in reality it was because the game changed the rules without giving you a heads up, which most players will only realize once they finish bashing their head against the wall. It feels sort of like getting to the end of an RPG after hours of necessary leveling, wherein the final boss is significantly easier depending on how low level you are. Or like a racing game where during the final lap you have to pull a sick Yui and go in reverse or else you lose the race. Just something that completely goes against what the game has taught you thus far. And lastly, I was pretty irked by the gall of the developer to put in a request to all streamers and Let's Players to play up until the final section and then stop, and encourage their audience to play it for themselves if they want to see how it ends. It strikes me as such a transparent attempt to take advantage of people by preventing content creators from showing the ending of the game, and hiding the fact that the ending is an anticlimactic garbage dump, a fact that most people won't realize until it's too late and they've already paid full price. We don't want to spoil the ending for new players, so please don't show this part. Oh, you mean the part where Maya goes and finds all of her friends and releases them, and there's like 5 of them, and if you die, you have to go back to the earlier checkpoint, and then Maya escapes the hotel. Jimmy talks to his alter ego Hugo. The game dispenses the platitude of "we all have some darkness in us." We don't get any closure of Hugo's arrest or subsequent punishment as vengeance for all of the deaths he was responsible for, and then the game just ends? Like Maya's entire crusade to validate and avenge these spirits just never gets a climax? Damn, somebody call Tarantino, he's got some serious competition. And if content creators ignore his wish and opt to just record it anyway, he won't necessarily take down your video, but it risks some audience members being like, "Hey man, that's not cool. He asked you not to show this part, man." Like, no, fuck you. I bought the fucking game. I'm gonna play it through to its entirety. And if people see the inconclusive ending and decide not to purchase it for themselves, then that's their call. And I'm not gonna blue ball them just because you put the onus on me to respect whatever weirdly strict creative outcome you had in mind. I'm fine, deep breath. That said, I don't think $15 is even slightly outrageous for a game of this caliber. For the visual spectacle alone, I feel like he could have charged $30 and had diehard puzzle-loving masochists raving about it for the ghost hunting mechanics alone. So I think that's a perfectly fair price point for a game like this. I just think you have to accept that if your gameplay is one-note and repetitive with very little variance in design or outcome, you shouldn't be surprised when most viewers don't opt to buy what is essentially the equivalent of a cat and mouse game with some puzzle solving crammed in there. Like I said, I really appreciate what this game tried to do, and it is the single most beautifully rendered game I've ever played in my entire life, to the extent that I have to ask what sort of fucking blood magic incantation Baggy Cat chanted in order to perfectly superimpose a human hand onto a 3D background, or which objects in question are even 3D or real filmed videos in the first place. But it's just boring, which is really sad, because it's an extremely interesting concept for a game, but unfortunately it really only makes good Let's Play or streaming material unless you happen to be a hardcore puzzle/supernatural fan and want to play a mind-numbingly obtuse puzzle game that eventually breaks its own rules and never bothers to tell you outright. The amount of sheer trial and error makes this game a complete slog to get through, with the story being the only redeemable aspect. The slightest amount of aha or relief experienced from finally making progress in the game is completely undermined by the sheer hours of slamming your head against the wall just to make the tiniest progress. Honestly, just watch John Wolfe play it and save your money. And to the developer, I highly recommend being more transparent with your customers and interacting with them more regularly, since a cursory glance through the Steam forums will show that he seems to pick and choose what he'll respond to, while ignoring completely reasonable questions about adding an option to disable motion blur for accessibility's sake, to name one example. I think it speaks to his inflexibility regarding game design that he doesn't seem to value feedback from paying players, and that's a shame, because I think adding the option to skip the scrying mirror cinematic and adding a map would go a long way towards making the game more accessible to anyone other than complete masochists. But I guess since he's the guy who made the game, we lowly peons don't deserve a response. I will say I'll be watching whatever games he works on in the future, since this is only his second game, and I'm hopeful that he'll learn from this game's flaws and make something truly brilliant next time around, but I guess we'll see. Anyway, thanks for watching. Bye.